The sound of my front door slamming against the wall at 7 in the morning wasn't how I expected to start the most important day of my professional life. But there stood Richard Sterling, my father-in-law, clutching a crumpled piece of paper like it was a weapon. His face twisted with the kind of rage I'd grown accustomed to over 7 years of marriage to his son. I had learned long ago that the Sterling family saw me as an outsider, a woman who had somehow tricked their precious Victor into marriage. What they didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for longer than they could imagine. My name is Thorne, and this is the story of how I reclaimed my life from the family that tried to destroy it. The morning Richard burst into my home, I was preparing for a video conference that could change my career. As a licensed architect, I had spent months developing a proposal for the city's new cultural center. My home office, which I had designed myself, reflected everything I valued: clean lines, natural light, and a sense of permanence that I had craved since childhood. Every piece of furniture, every carefully chosen paint color, represented my journey from a girl who grew up in foster care to a successful professional who had built her own sanctuary. Richard had used the spare key I had foolishly given him months earlier, back when I still believed that family meant something to the Sterlings. His eyes swept across my living room with the same disdain he had shown me since the day Victor brought me home. The Persian rug beneath his feet, the custom-built bookshelves lining the walls, the original artwork I had collected over the years, all of it seemed to mock him now. "You have 48 hours to get out of my son's house," he declared, throwing the paper onto my coffee table. "Or I'll personally see that you're thrown out on the street where you belong." I took a slow sip of my coffee, noting how Mrs. Patterson next door was suddenly very interested in pruning her already perfect rose bushes. The woman had lived next to me for 3 years and had witnessed more Sterling family drama than any neighbor should have to endure. I also noticed how the small security camera I had discreetly installed last month captured every word Richard was saying. "Mr. Sterling," I said, setting down my cup with deliberate calm, "do you really think I would invest 8 years of my life, my savings, and my heart into building a home only to be tossed aside like yesterday's newspaper?" I walked to my desk and retrieved a thick manila envelope from the locked drawer. Richard continued his tirade about Sterling money, family honor, and my supposedly deceptive marriage to his son. But his words felt hollow now, like the empty threats of a man who had never faced real opposition. "Before you continue," I said, opening the envelope, "you might want to see this." I placed the deed to the house squarely in front of him. Maya Thorne, sole owner. No Victor Sterling anywhere on this document. The color drained from Richard's face as he stared at the legal paperwork. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "That's impossible. Victor told me he bought this house. He said it was an investment." I pulled out a second folder, this one containing 8 years' worth of mortgage payments, all from my personal checking account. "Every brick, every nail, every blade of grass in this yard was paid for with my money, Mr. Sterling. Victor has never contributed a single dollar to this household." The truth was, I had learned early in my marriage that Victor Sterling was everything his father had raised him to be: entitled, irresponsible, and utterly incapable of taking care of himself. While Richard saw his son as a successful businessman, I lived with the reality of a man who couldn't hold a job for more than 6 months and had never paid a bill on time in his adult life. Richard fumbled for his phone, calling his attorney with shaking hands. "Caldwell, I need you to look into something immediately. There's been some kind of fraud, some conspiracy against my family." His voice cracked as he spoke, the confidence that had carried him through the door now completely shattered. While he argued with his lawyer, I sent a quick text to my brother Daniel. "The show is starting. Time to take the stage." Richard ended his call and turned back to me, trying to regain his composure. "My attorney will find a way to fix this. You'll pay for deceiving my son, for taking advantage of his trust." "Deceiving him?" I laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut glass. "Or was I simply smarter than you gave me credit for? Perhaps you should ask your attorney about the legal consequences of breaking and entering, harassment, and presenting fraudulent documents." It was then that I decided to show Richard exactly who his son really was. I opened a third folder, this one containing information that would shatter every illusion he had about Victor. "Mr. Sterling, would you like to know why I was so careful about protecting my assets? It wasn't because I didn't love your son. It was because I knew exactly what kind of man he was." The first document I showed him was the prenuptial agreement that Richard himself had insisted upon, designed to protect Victor's supposed wealth from a gold-digging wife like me. "You demanded this contract to protect your son's assets from me. Ironically, it's now protecting my assets from him." The second folder contained bank statements and a detailed report from private investigator Sarah Jenkins. "These documents show your son's gambling debts, which currently total over $200,000. They also detail the business schemes he's attempted to run, all of which failed because he used the startup capital at underground poker games and high-end escort services." Richard's hands trembled as he looked at the evidence. Transaction after transaction showed Victor requesting money from his father for various investment opportunities, only to lose it all within days at casinos and private gambling clubs. "This can't be right," Richard whispered. "Victor told me he was expanding his real estate portfolio. He said he was making strategic investments." I turned my laptop screen toward him, showing social media posts that Victor hadn't been careful enough to hide. "Your son isn't finding himself in some spiritual retreat, Mr. Sterling. These photos were taken 3 days ago in Macau, at the Grand Lisboa Casino. He's been funding this lifestyle with money he's stolen from you, and when that wasn't enough, he tried to steal from me." The final blow came when I showed Richard the bank documents detailing Victor's attempt to forge my signature on a home equity loan 6 months earlier. He didn't just want your money anymore. He wanted to steal my house, make me homeless, and leave me with nothing. That's when I knew I had to protect myself. Richard collapsed into my armchair, his face buried in his hands. For the first time in the 7 years I had known him, he looked like what he truly was. An old man who had enabled his son's destruction out of misguided love. "I've been so blind," he said, his voice barely audible. "I thought I was helping him, protecting him after his mother died, but I turned him into a monster." I felt no satisfaction in watching Richard crumble. Despite everything he had put me through, I could see that he genuinely believed he had been acting in his son's best interest. "The boy you're trying to protect doesn't exist anymore, Mr. Sterling. Maybe he never did." I handed him a business card for a gambling addiction treatment center. "If you really want to help Victor, this is the only way. But first, you need to stop enabling him." 3 days later, Daniel and I sat in his law office, finalizing the divorce papers and the restraining order against Victor. Richard had called the night before, asking if he could attend the proceedings. To my surprise, I said yes. When Richard arrived, he looked like he had aged a decade in 72 hours. He sat quietly as Daniel explained the legal protections we were putting in place, and he didn't object when I detailed the financial abuse I had endured. "Maya," Richard said when the lawyers finished their paperwork, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the truth. I've spent 7 years treating you like you weren't good enough for our family, when the reality is that our family was never good enough for you." His admission should have felt like a victory, but instead, it felt hollow. "Your apology means nothing after 7 years of psychological warfare, Richard. It doesn't erase the damage you've done, or the person you helped your son become." That's when Richard's phone rang. Victor's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, I saw the old Richard resurface, the father ready to rescue his son from another crisis. But then he looked at me, took a deep breath, and answered the call on speaker. "Dad, I need you to wire me $50,000 immediately." Victor's voice was frantic, desperate. "I'm in serious trouble here. These people, they're not joking around." Richard closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were filled with a resolve I had never seen before. "Victor, the house you've been living in belongs to Maya. It always has. Your marriage is over, your lies have been exposed, and your free ride is finished." "What are you talking about?" Victor's voice rose to a shriek. "That's impossible. Maya's just an architect. She doesn't have that kind of money." "Maya built that home with her own savings while you were gambling away everything I gave you," Richard replied. "I've seen the evidence, son. I know about the casinos, the escorts, the forged documents. You tried to steal from your own wife." The phone erupted with Victor's threats and pleas, but Richard remained firm. "You need help, Victor. Real help. But I won't be sending you any more money. When you're ready to get clean, to face what you've become, I'll be here. Until then, you're on your own." He ended the call and sat in silence for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but sad. "Thank you, Maya. You opened my eyes to what I had created." 2 weeks later, I stood in the empty house that had been my sanctuary, my prison, and finally, my victory. A young couple from Seattle had offered me considerably more than the asking price, charmed by the custom architecture and the story of the woman who had designed her own dream home. Richard appeared at my door one last time, carrying an envelope. "I know you don't want to see me," he said, "but I needed to give you this before you left." Inside was a check for $50,000 and a handwritten letter. "This is the money Victor stole from me for his so-called house purchase." The letter read, "It rightfully belongs to you, as the true owner of that home. Please use it for a fresh start. You deserve every happiness that my family denied you." I stared at the check for a long time, thinking about all the ways that money could change my life. But then I thought about Victor, somewhere in a Macau jail cell, and all the other people whose lives had been destroyed by gambling addiction. I drove to the treatment center whose card I had given Richard and donated the entire amount to their family support program. My new penthouse apartment overlooked the city skyline, with floor-to-ceiling windows that filled every room with light. The space was smaller than my house had been, but it felt infinite because it was truly mine. No spare keys existed for anyone else. No one could enter without my permission. No one could take it away. The architectural firm where I'd been a senior associate for 5 years offered me a partnership position, along with the lead on the cultural center project I had been developing. My presentation had been flawless that morning. Richard broke into my home, despite the drama happening in my personal life. Perhaps the adrenaline had actually helped my performance. On a warm autumn afternoon, 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. The return address showed a correctional facility in Macau. Victor had written from prison, full of apologies and promises to change. He claimed to understand now what he had put me through, begged for forgiveness, and asked if I would be willing to help him when he was released. I read the first paragraph, then walked to my kitchen and dropped the letter directly into the trash compactor. Some stories don't deserve an ending. Richard and I maintained an unusual relationship in the months that followed. He would call occasionally, updating me on Victor's situation and his own journey through therapy. He had joined a support group for families affected by gambling addiction and was learning to set boundaries for the first time in his life. To my surprise, I found myself looking forward to these conversations. The man who emerged from the wreckage of his son's destruction was someone I could respect, even if I could never fully forgive. "I've been thinking about something you said," Richard told me during one of our calls, "about how I created a monster by trying to protect Victor from consequences. I realize now that I didn't just fail him, I failed you too. I taught him that he could treat people badly and someone would always clean up the mess. The difference is that Victor chose to hurt people," I replied. "You were misguided, but you weren't malicious. Does that matter to the people who got hurt along the way?" It was a fair question, one I had been asking myself for months. I think it matters in terms of whether someone can change. Victor hurt people for his own pleasure and gain. You hurt people because you thought you were protecting someone you loved. One of those things can be forgiven. 3 years after that morning when Richard broke down my door, I received an invitation to his 70th birthday party. It was a small gathering, mostly members of his support group and a few old friends who had stuck by him through his family's scandals. Victor was still serving his sentence and wouldn't be eligible for parole for another 2 years. I almost didn't go, but something made me change my mind at the last minute. When I arrived at the modest restaurant where the party was being held, Richard's face lit up with genuine joy. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, embracing me carefully, as if I might disappear. "I wasn't sure either," I admitted. "But I realized something recently. You're the only family I have left who's actually trying to be better." We talked for hours that night about architecture, about his volunteer work with gambling addiction counselors, about the books we were reading and the movies we'd seen. For the first time in our relationship, we weren't talking around the Victor-shaped hole in both our lives. We were simply two people who had survived a terrible experience and were trying to build something better from the pieces. As I drove home that night, I thought about the woman I had been when this story started. She had been strong, but she had also been isolated, carrying the burden of her husband's failures alone because she was afraid of what people would think. She had been successful, but she had measured that success partly by her ability to maintain the facade of a happy marriage. The woman I had become was different. She had learned that true strength came not from enduring abuse, but from having the courage to walk away from it. She had discovered that her value didn't depend on anyone else's approval or recognition. Most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the most radical act of self-love is simply refusing to accept less than you deserve. My architectural firm was thriving, with 3 major projects in development and a waiting list of clients who specifically requested to work with me. The cultural center I had designed was nearly complete, its soaring glass walls and innovative use of natural light earning recognition from design magazines across the country. But the achievement I was most proud of wasn't visible in any building. I had created a life that belonged entirely to me. Every friendship was genuine, every professional relationship built on mutual respect, every decision made with my own best interests at heart. I had learned to say no without explanation, to set boundaries without guilt, and to prioritize my own well-being without apology. The Sterling family's money was gone, their reputation in tatters, their golden boy serving time in a foreign prison, but their destruction hadn't been my goal. My goal had been my own resurrection, and in that, I had succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. Standing on my balcony 30 floors above the city, watching the lights twinkle like earthbound stars, I finally understood what freedom felt like. It wasn't the absence of problems or challenges. It was the knowledge that whatever came next, I would face it as myself, on my own terms, with my own power. The girl who had grown up in foster care, dreaming of a home she could never lose, had finally found what she was looking for. Not in a house or a husband or a family name, but in the unshakable foundation of her own self-worth. And that, I realized, was the most beautiful architecture of all.